I was about 15 when it happened, staying at our family's summer cabin. It was the kind of place you only get to visit a few times a year, tucked away on a hill overlooking a small lake. The cabin itself sat high up, surrounded by thick, dense forest, so thick you couldn't see beyond the tree line in any direction. From the windows, all you really saw was the hill dropping down to another cabin by the water's edge. That lower cabin was connected to the shore by an old wooden bridge, and right next to it were two small boats tied to a rickety dock. We had gone there for a long weekend. It was supposed to be relaxing, a way to escape the noise and pressure of everyday life. My dad, my sister, my 3 cousins, and their dad decided to go down to the lake around 9 at night. My grandparents, aunt, and mom stayed back at the cabin. They said it was getting late, and besides, they wanted to stay warm inside. We took the grandparents' dog, a big, old Labrador, and our cousin's smaller dog with us. The walk down the hill was quiet except for the dogs sniffing around and the crunch of leaves under our feet. When we got to the bottom near the lake, the air felt colder and heavier. The trees surrounding the water made it feel like we were in a little clearing carved out just for us, but the forest pressed in close on every side. We gathered some dry wood and started a fire near the water's edge. The flames flickered against the darkness, casting long shadows on the trees and reflecting on the calm surface of the lake. We sat around the fire, staring out at the water and the stars above, trying to enjoy the peaceful night. For a while, the conversation moved from one topic to another, the usual summer stuff, plans for school, jokes about things that happened earlier in the day. But as the fire died down and the night got quieter, the talking slowed and finally stopped altogether. We all just sat there in the silence, listening to the soft crackling of the fire and the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore. That's when I first noticed it. It wasn't a sound or a movement, at least not at first. It was a feeling, like something was watching us from the edge of the forest. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination, that the woods were full of noises, shadows, and shapes that looked like people in the dark. But the feeling didn't go away. It got stronger, heavier, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. We were all sitting with our backs to the woods, facing the lake and the fire. No one else seemed to notice it, or at least no one said anything. I looked sideways at my dad, who was sitting beside my cousin. He was quiet, staring at the fire like he was thinking about something far away. Then, without warning, he said, "Yes, I'm good." Everyone turned to look at him, confused. No one had asked a question. The silence stretched out as we all waited to see what he would say next. He looked back toward the cabin, then at my cousin, who was sitting right next to him. "Yeah, I'm doing good," he said again. My cousin blinked. "What?" she asked. "You asked me how I was doing, so I answered," my dad said. "No, I didn't," she said, clearly confused. Dad looked puzzled too. He ran a hand through his hair and said quietly, "I felt someone lean over and whisper in my ear, 'Hello? How are you?'" He described it exactly, the breath on his neck, the hand on his shoulder. At first, he thought it was my mom playing a joke on him. He turned around quickly, but there was no one there. The woods were still. Nothing moved. The air around us suddenly felt colder, like the warmth from the fire was being pulled away. Then the 2 dogs started growling fiercely, low and loud. Their eyes were fixed on the woods behind my dad, the place where he said he had felt the presence. They were tense, their hackles raised, and they wouldn't stop growling. It wasn't the kind of growl that came from a stranger or a wild animal passing by. It was a deep warning, like they were trying to protect us from something invisible. That's when panic started to set in. We all put the fire out as quickly as we could. The night became pitch black almost instantly once the flames died. Our footsteps crunched loudly on the dry leaves as we sprinted back up the hill to the cabin. No one talked during the run, but the feeling of being watched stayed with us, hanging thick in the air. Once inside, the door slammed shut behind us. The forest outside looked like a solid wall of black. We didn't open the windows or step outside again after dark for the rest of the trip. The dogs stayed close to us the whole time, growling at shadows and any sound from the woods. In the days that followed, we all avoided the lake after sunset. The memory of that night stuck with me, clear as if it happened yesterday. Whatever was there at the bottom of the hill wasn't human. It didn't seem angry or dangerous, but it wasn't something we could explain either. It felt like it had just been curious, maybe even polite, enough to whisper a greeting, but too strange to ignore. We never saw anything, no glowing eyes or shapes in the trees, just that feeling. The feeling that someone or something was watching from the dark, waiting, and maybe trying to reach out in the only way it knew how. Since then, I've thought a lot about what it could have been. The only thing that made any sense was a story I heard once about a nature spirit from Swedish folklore, called a vitra. They're said to play tricks on people but aren't usually harmful unless provoked. They can be dangerous if they want to be, but sometimes they just watch, and sometimes they even try to talk in strange ways. I don't know if that's what we encountered, but it's the closest explanation I can find that doesn't sound like a ghost story or some made-up myth. Whatever it was, it didn't want to scare us badly or hurt us. It just wanted to say hello in a place where nobody else would hear. The memory still gives me chills when I think about it, but it also reminds me that some things in the forest don't need to show themselves to make their presence known. Sometimes, all it takes is a whisper in your ear, a breath on your neck, and the quiet warning growl of a dog to tell you that the woods are alive in ways we don't understand. I lived in rural Maine back in the fall of 2011, when I was a freshman in college. My boyfriend at the time had this weird thing about showing me cool places he'd heard about from his college professors or friends. One day, he told me he wanted to take me on a drive, said he wanted to show me something special, something off the beaten path. We already lived in the middle of nowhere. Our house was miles from the nearest town, down dirt roads lined thick with forest. But this time, we went even deeper into the woods, farther than I'd ever been before. We got into his old, beat-up truck and started driving. The road was narrow, winding, and completely surrounded by trees on both sides. For what felt like 5 or 8 miles, there were no houses, no mailboxes, no signs, not even a driveway to break up the monotony of endless forest. The only thing around was the occasional fallen branch or rocks scattered along the edges. The whole scene was silent except for the truck's engine and the crunch of gravel beneath the tires. Eventually, he pulled over near a small break in the trees. The spot looked barely noticeable, just an old, rusted chain stretched across a dirt driveway, hanging loosely on both sides. There was a weathered wooden sign nailed to a post next to the chain. The paint was chipped and faded, but I could just make out the words, "Private property." The whole thing looked abandoned, like nobody had been there for decades. We parked on the side of the road and climbed out. The air was crisp and smelled like wet earth and pine needles. We walked past the chain, stepping carefully over the uneven ground, following that narrow dirt driveway which was barely wide enough for a single truck. The grass and weeds were tall and overgrown, and branches hung low, brushing against my jacket sleeves. The further we walked, the quieter it got. No birds, no wind rustling the leaves, nothing but the sound of our footsteps. After about half a mile, we reached what looked like an old log cabin. It was completely run down. The logs were weathered gray, cracked, and some parts were rotting away. The roof sagged, and a few shingles were missing. The windows were boarded up, and the glass on what remained was dirty and cracked. It looked like it hadn't been lived in for a very long time. There were no power lines, no satellite dishes, no phone wires, just the cabin sitting alone in the middle of this dense forest. The place was so old that it didn't have any connection to electricity. Inside, there were no outlets, no lights. It was strange, like stepping back in time. My boyfriend said he'd been there before, that one of his professors had told him about this cabin and the land it sat on. He explained that the last person who owned the property had left a will stating that no changes could be made to it after their death. No farming, no renovations, nothing. Because of that, the land was basically frozen in time, untouched and abandoned. He led me around to the back of the cabin where there was a door, half hanging off its hinges. He said we could break in there. I remember he pulled a crowbar from his truck and pried the door open, making a loud creak that echoed in the stillness around us. Once inside, I wasn't exactly sure how we got to the loft. Either we climbed an old ladder or found some stairs hidden in the corner. Something like that. The loft was narrow and dark, with no railing on the edge. It overlooked the main floor of the cabin, where I could see an old ironwood stove sitting cold and rusty in the corner. There was a rough wooden countertop, but no sink, no plumbing anywhere. The kitchen was empty except for some cracked cabinets and the stove. The whole cabin was made of wood, and everything inside looked worn and faded from years of neglect. The loft itself was the creepiest part. The floor was covered in thousands of dead flies. They were everywhere, stuck on the wood like frozen black dust. The sheer number was sickening. I tried not to look too closely, but the flies were on every surface, walls, beams, even piled in corners. What creeped me out the most was that they weren't rotting or crumbling. They looked freshly dead, like something had killed them all at once and left them there to slowly die over years. For some reason, my boyfriend thought this was a good place to smoke weed. He laid a thin, ratty blanket over the flies and sat down on it, pulling out his rolling papers and weed. I wasn't into it, but I took a couple of puffs to keep him company. Almost immediately, I felt uneasy. Not just the weed, but the whole situation, the silence, the flies, the cabin. It didn't feel right. The air inside felt heavy, like the place itself was holding its breath. The sun started to set fast. The last light slipped through the cracked windows, casting long, twisting shadows across the walls. The cabin went from strange to terrifying in just a few minutes. The warmth of the daylight faded, and the woods outside looked darker and more menacing. I felt a sharp edge of panic settle into my chest. The place wasn't just abandoned. It felt like something else was there, watching us from the shadows beyond the broken windows. I told him I wanted to leave. I said it more than once, my voice shaking with worry. But he wasn't in a hurry. He took his time rolling a cigarette and even pulled out little things from his pockets. Keys, a lighter, loose change, and laid them all carefully on the blanket before putting them away slowly. It was like he was deliberately stalling, and that made me angrier. I felt trapped in that cabin with the dying light and a growing fear clawing at me. I couldn't stay still any longer. I jumped up and started heading toward the door, the cold floorboards creaking under my feet. I didn't look back. The moment I stepped outside, I started running down that overgrown driveway, dodging low branches and uneven ground. The chill of the evening air hit my face as I tried to put as much distance as possible between myself and that cabin. Behind me, I could hear him shuffling, fumbling with things in his hands, moving slower than me. The forest closed in around us, the trees like silent sentinels watching me flee. There was no streetlight, no moonlight yet, just the fading glow of dusk and thick darkness creeping closer. I didn't feel safe with him behind me or anywhere near that cabin. The whole way down the road, I had this heavy, sinking feeling, like something unseen was watching us, waiting for us to get careless. I don't know if it was my imagination, or if maybe my boyfriend was just too high to care, but the feeling was real to me. Dark, heavy, and full of danger. Once we finally got back to the truck and started driving out, the silence was deafening. He didn't say a word, and I couldn't bring myself to look at him. I kept replaying everything in my head, the flies, the cabin, the slow darkness. I realized how stupid I'd been to go along with him, to let him drag me that far into nowhere with no way out except a single narrow road. After that night, I never trusted him again. I couldn't forget that sick feeling of being watched and trapped in that cabin. The whole experience stayed with me like a shadow, something real and dark, without ghosts or stories, just the pure, heavy weight of a place abandoned but still dangerous. I cut him out of my life soon after. I never needed another reminder of how easily a bad situation could get worse when you don't listen to that gut feeling telling you to run. The cabin, the flies, the forest, and the silence. Those were the things I still see clearly, and I'll never go back there. I was 11 when this happened. Anna was 14 and Becky was 8. My dad worked as a freelance programmer. When I was younger, he made pretty good money on his projects, but he was buried under a mountain of debt, over $500,000, and my mom wasn't very good at managing money either. So even though my dad's jobs paid well, we never really had much free money. We usually went on vacation only once every few years, and most times it was just to visit relatives. One day, my dad finished a long project for a big client. To celebrate, we were watching the new Final Destination movie. Dad loved scary movies, and he enjoyed scaring me and my sisters. We were right in the middle of the movie, the tension building, when the phone rang. Dad got up to answer it. After he hung up, he went to get Mom, who was in the kitchen. Meanwhile, Becky paused the movie and grabbed Duchess, our dog, because she was scared of the movie noises. Dad and Mom came back about 10 minutes later. They told us we were going to spend the weekend in a cabin. None of us knew what to think. Apparently, the client dad had just finished working for owned a cabin by a lake in the mountains, and they offered to let us stay there for a very low price. It was Thursday, and suddenly Mom was panicking, rushing to pack all our things. We never got to finish the movie that night. The next day after school, we loaded up the family van and started the drive to the mountains. It was about 2.5 hours, so it was already late when we finally arrived. The cabin was a ranch-style wooden building with a wide porch facing the lake. It looked old but solid, like it had been there for decades, surrounded by tall pine and spruce trees. The air smelled sharp and fresh, very different from the city. Inside, the cabin was cozy but simple. There was a living room with a big stone fireplace, a small kitchen with old appliances, and 3 bedrooms. One thing that caught our attention was a small nook in the corner of the living room, just big enough for kids to climb into. It was about 3 feet tall, maybe meant for storage or hiding things. But Anna, Becky, and I thought it was perfect for us to hang out and play games. There was a shelf full of board games, a whole stack of them, so we spent some time picking which ones to play. After exploring, Mom and Dad picked the biggest bedroom. Anna took the smaller room with the twin bed. Becky and I ended up sharing the last room, which had a queen-sized bed. The bed was pushed against the wall with a window right next to it. The window didn't have curtains, so you could see outside clearly. On the other side of the bed, there was a small lamp that gave off a soft yellow light. It was the only light source in the room after dark. Opposite the bed was a closet, but the door was locked. We never found out what was inside it. That first night, we went to bed around 11. Becky was a kicker in her sleep, so I slept on the side with the lamp to keep it safe from being knocked over. I remember lying down and almost immediately falling asleep. Then, out of nowhere, Becky grabbed my arm and tried to crawl under me. She was whispering something, but I couldn't understand her. When I sat up, I looked toward the window and saw a pale shape moving away from it. It was human-shaped, but blurry and faint, like someone had just slipped past the glass. I woke up fully and grabbed Becky. We rushed out of the room to find Mom and Dad. Dad told us we were probably just imagining things, and Mom said to go back to bed but let them know if we saw anything else. I was frustrated but too tired to argue, so Becky and I went back. We switched spots because Becky didn't want to sleep next to the window anymore. I told her a story until she fell asleep, then I drifted off myself. The next morning, we explored around the lake for a bit. The water was cold and clear, surrounded by thick woods that stretched for miles. We saw birds and small animals. Nothing unusual, just the quiet sounds of nature. Later, Dad decided to take us to the nearby town. It was a small place with a few shops and restaurants. Mom and Dad went into every store, buying snacks and souvenirs. We ate lunch and dinner there before heading back to the cabin. As we walked toward the cabin, Anna joked about something silly, and we all laughed. But just as we reached the porch, Dad stopped. He raised his hand to signal us to be quiet, then pushed the door open with a single finger. It wasn't latched, which felt odd. Dad went inside and disappeared for a couple of minutes. Mom called his name and he told us to come in. Once inside, he locked the door behind us and took Mom to the bedroom for a quick talk. Anna realized something was off and decided to distract Becky and me by suggesting we play another board game. We hadn't been playing long when Mom and Dad came back. Mom started cleaning up breakfast dishes and Dad joined our game. We played for hours until Dad told us to go to bed. It was only 9 o'clock, which annoyed Anna since she was allowed to stay up later on weekends. Becky and I went back to our room. We climbed into the same spots we had the first night. Becky by the window, me by the lamp. I read a little to Duchess until Becky fell asleep. Then I dozed off too. Suddenly, I woke up to Dad rushing into the room. He grabbed Becky from the bed and pulled me up by the hand. I saw Mom doing the same to Anna in the hall. A high-pitched whining sound was coming from the living room. Duchess was sitting near the back door, her fur standing up, alert and tense. Dad didn't put Becky down and kept a firm grip on my hand as they hurried us outside to the van. Dad ran back to grab Duchess, then got in and started the engine fast. We left the cabin behind, the tires crunching over the gravel as he drove away without a word. It took about half an hour for Duchess to calm down. The next day, Dad told Anna what had happened. Becky and I didn't hear the whole story until years later. Dad had been woken up by moaning sounds outside his window. When he looked, he found the front door unlocked. Things in the kitchen were out of place, moved around as if someone had been inside. Duchess was growling at the locked back door. Dad quickly locked it and decided we had to get out. He went back the next day to get our luggage and found footprints around the window of the room Becky and I had slept in. They were big and heavy, like someone had been watching us. The footprints made it clear we weren't alone in that cabin. After that, Dad never wanted to stay in places like that again. The whole weekend felt wrong. The woods, the unlocked doors, the noises outside. The cabin had been far from safe. It wasn't ghosts or stories from movies. It was something real and dangerous, and we were lucky to get out without anything worse happening. Even now, thinking back, I can still picture those footprints outside our window, and it reminds me that some places hide things you don't want to find. A few years ago, in the summer of 2020, something happened that still sticks with me, even though I've gone back and forth about sharing it. It was mid-July, and the world was in a strange place. Everything was shut down, people stuck inside, and the usual noise of daily life was gone. My girlfriend at the time, Sarah, my best friend Rob, and his sister Claire all decided we needed a break. We wanted to get away from everything, to be somewhere quiet and off the grid. No phones, no crowds, just trees and silence. Rob's uncle owns a small cabin out in the UCOR National Forest, a place so isolated it feels like another world. It's nothing fancy. No power, no running water, just an old propane stove, a wood stove for heat, a few bunk beds, and an outhouse about 50 feet behind the cabin. It's a 45-minute drive on dirt roads from the nearest paved road, and when you're there, you really feel cut off. We arrived on a Friday afternoon. The cabin had this musky smell, not the kind that's gross or dirty, but the smell of old wood and dust mixed with forest air. The kind of smell that makes you feel like you're stepping back in time or into a place people haven't touched in a while. The cabin looked like it was waiting for us, quiet and still, and I was surprised there were no signs of mice or other animals getting inside. Usually, with a place that old and out in the woods, you expect a few critters to have made themselves at home, but this one looked untouched. We unpacked our stuff quickly and made dinner on the propane stove. It wasn't anything fancy, just some pasta and canned sauce, but eating it in that cabin felt different. After dinner, we spent the evening outside, playing cards on a makeshift table Rob had set up, looking up at the stars. The sky was so clear, the stars bright like I hadn't seen in a long time. No city lights, no planes flying over, just silence except for the sounds of the forest. It was honestly one of the best nights I've had outdoors. We laughed, joked, and felt like time had slowed down. Around 11:30 p.m., we decided to turn in. The cabin is small, one main room with a tiny kitchen off to the side, and we all took our spots in the bunk beds. Rob and Claire took the bottom bunks, Sarah and I the top ones. Before we went to sleep, we locked the front door with an old metal bolt that slid across the wood. It's definitely not modern security, but it was something. I woke up at 2:30 a.m. It wasn't because of a noise at first, more like a feeling. You know that moment when your brain just pulls you out of sleep for no reason, like a gut feeling that something's off? That's what happened. Then I started hearing footsteps, not the usual wildlife sounds. No scurrying, no twigs snapping, but slow, steady, heavy footsteps on the front porch. They sounded like someone wearing work boots walking on old wood planks. I stayed still, barely breathing, trying to listen. I thought maybe it was Rob going out to pee, but when I carefully peeked over the edge of my bunk, I could see him still wrapped up in his sleeping bag. Same with Claire. I whispered to Sarah, and she was already awake. She just nodded when I asked if she heard it too. The footsteps stopped, and after a few minutes, everything went quiet again. We didn't hear anything else, so I slowly got out of bed, grabbed my flashlight, and opened the door. Nothing. No footprints in the dirt. No sounds in the woods. No movement at all. Just dead stillness and the smell of wet earth and pine. I walked a few steps toward the clearing, shining my light around, but saw nothing unusual. I went back inside and told the others it was probably just nerves or maybe an animal we misheard. We all tried to convince ourselves of that and went back to sleep. The next morning, the air was cool and fresh, but the first thing I noticed when we stepped outside was the old wooden shed behind the cabin, about 25 yards into the woods, wide open. We hadn't been near it the night before. Rob joked that it looked like something out of a horror movie. The door was warped and sagging, half covered in moss. Inside, there were old tools, chopped firewood, rusted nails, and other junk. Nothing dangerous, just random stuff piled up. But it definitely looked like someone had been in there. The axe was leaning against the door instead of being wrecked on a pile of wood, and a coil of rope had been dropped and partly uncoiled. Claire said it even smelled faintly like tobacco inside, which none of us had brought that night. We all felt a little uneasy. We double-checked the bolt on the front door, moved our bags closer together, and tried to laugh it off with jokes about the cabin being haunted. But there was definitely a heavier feeling hanging over us. That night was worse than the first. Around 1:45 a.m., we all heard the front door creak open. It wasn't a quick noise. It was long and slow, like in the movies when something sinister is about to happen. The weirdest part was the door was still bolted shut. We checked it immediately. It hadn't moved, but we all heard it. It was loud enough that Rob sat up right away and whispered, "Is someone outside?" We grabbed our flashlights and searched the area again. Nothing. No animals, no wind, no movement in the trees. But the air felt different. Heavy, like before a storm, but there weren't any clouds or wind. Just a thick silence that pressed down on you. We barely slept after that. Every little sound made us jump. The next morning, we found something new. On the outside of one of the back windows, there was a handprint. It was faint but sticky, like someone had pressed their bare hand against the glass and left a residue. None of us remembered touching that window, and Claire was sure she hadn't even been near that side of the cabin. That was the final straw. We packed up and left a day earlier than planned. On the way out, we stopped to call Rob's uncle and told him what happened. He laughed it off, saying, "Oh, you met the cabin ghost." He said other people had reported footsteps and strange door sounds over the years, but insisted it was harmless. He never mentioned any of that when we were planning the trip. I'm not saying the place is haunted. I'm not one for ghost stories or superstition. Could it have been an animal? Maybe. But we've all spent enough time camping to know what raccoons, coyotes, or bears sound like. This felt different, purposeful, like someone was out there watching, trying to get in. Since then, we've camped plenty of other places, but none of us have ever gone back to that cabin. Something about it stays with me. That feeling of being watched, the footsteps, the door creaking when it was locked, the open shed, and the handprint. It doesn't make sense, and I still don't know what to make of it. But one thing's for sure, there's more to that place than just an old cabin in the woods. And sometimes, when I'm lying in bed, I can't help but wonder who or what was out there that night, standing just outside the door. A couple of autumns ago, I went out to a cabin deep in the Pacific Northwest woods with a good friend of mine. His family owns this place. 60 acres of thick forest, no neighbors anywhere close, and the nearest paved road is at least 2 miles away, maybe more. The cabin itself is tucked far back, hidden by tall evergreens and dense underbrush. You wouldn't find it unless you already knew the way. A mile down the access trail, there's a locked steel gate to keep out anyone who doesn't belong, like hunters or random trespassers. The whole property feels cut off from the world. The first time I went out there, I felt completely at peace. The usual animals. Black bears, coyotes, raccoons were common sights or sounds, but none of it ever made me feel uneasy. Sometimes you'd hear owls hooting or an elk crashing through the brush far away, but it was just nature doing its thing. The isolation didn't feel threatening. It felt safe, like being inside a giant, quiet bubble away from everything else. That weekend, it was just me, my friend, and his old dog. We packed a cooler with food, brought along a couple of shotguns just in case, and left our phones behind since there was no signal out there anyway. No Wi-Fi, no distractions. The goal was to unplug completely and spend the weekend hiking, shooting cans, doing some light work on the cabin, and just enjoying the quiet. The first day was typical. We spent hours wandering through the woods, checking trails, cutting down brush that was starting to grow over some paths, and fixing up the wood stove chimney so it would draw properly once we started a fire. We chopped firewood and hauled it inside to keep dry. The dog followed us around, sniffing everything but mostly just laying down in the sun when he got tired. We took turns shooting at cans with the shotguns, laughing when we missed or when a can exploded in a shower of rust and aluminum. It was peaceful. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. We built a fire pit outside the cabin and cooked dinner over the flames. Hot dogs, some baked beans, and roasted marshmallows for dessert. We drank a few beers, feeling the heat from the fire while the woods grew darker around us. The stars were incredible, more than I'd ever seen from anywhere else, like millions of tiny fires scattered across the black sky. When the fire died down, we went inside and lit a few candles, giving the cabin a warm, soft glow. Inside, my friend pulled out his fly tying gear. He's really into fly fishing, and I'd picked up the hobby too, so he brought along his vise, feathers, thread, and some hooks. We sat at the small table, chatting quietly while we worked on tying flies. The Bluetooth speaker played soft music in the background, filling the cabin with a gentle hum that made the place feel cozy. The dog lay by the wood stove, occasionally shifting closer as the fire's warmth radiated through the room. Time slipped away as we tied fly after fly, sharing tips and stories about fishing spots. Around midnight, we were starting to pack up the gear, ready to call it a night. That's when it started. 3 loud, hard slams on the back door. Bang, bang, bang. The sound made both of us freeze instantly. The hair on my arms stood up, and my whole body tensed like when you suddenly realize something's wrong. Each hit made the whole door shake in its frame. Slow, deliberate, like someone was trying to get in. It wasn't like an animal brushing past or a falling branch. It was purposeful, heavy, and forceful. Then the Bluetooth speaker cut out. No warning, no low battery beep, no disconnection sound, just dead silence. It had been fully charged before we arrived. The music stopped, and the quiet that followed was heavier than any silence I'd ever experienced. The dog, who had been lying quietly by the stove, suddenly stood up and stared fixedly at the back door. He didn't bark or growl, he just locked his gaze on it, stiff and alert. Outside, everything went completely silent. No wind, no insects, no distant sounds from the forest. The kind of stillness you feel rather than hear, the kind that makes your skin crawl because it feels unnatural. It was like the entire forest was holding its breath. We sat motionless for what felt like a solid minute, neither of us daring to move or speak. Finally, my friend whispered, "Did you lock the back door?" I nodded. I was sure I had, but we both got up and grabbed the shotguns and a flashlight anyway. We moved quietly to check every door and window, shining the flashlight through the glass and onto the surrounding trees. The forest looked normal, just shadows and darkness, nothing out of place. No footprints, no broken branches, no signs of anyone or anything near the cabin. At one point, while sweeping the flashlight beam across the tree line, both of us saw something move, just a flicker of motion. Not a full shape, just a brief, blurred movement that quickly slipped out of the light. It was like whatever it was, it knew exactly where the light was and avoided it on purpose. We froze, staring into the dark woods, but there was nothing else. We decided to bunk in the loft upstairs, shotguns close at hand. The cabin felt smaller suddenly, more vulnerable. We barely spoke, the silence between us thick and heavy. There were no more knocks, no sounds at all, just that unbearable quiet pressing down on us. Hours passed like that, the only noise the occasional crackle from the wood stove. The dog lay between us, alert but silent. I kept thinking about what that banging could have been. It wasn't an animal, that was clear, and it wasn't wind or falling branches. It was something strong enough to dent the metal door and crack the door jamb. When dawn finally came, around 5:30 a.m., the forest slowly began to wake up. The silence broke with the chirping of crickets and the distant calls of birds. We breathed a quiet sigh of relief, but the unease lingered. In the daylight, we inspected the back door. There was a deep dent low on the metal panel, about waist height for an average man. The door jamb was cracked, showing signs of heavy impact, but there were no footprints in the dirt around the door. No broken twigs, no disturbed leaves, nothing to indicate how someone or something had gotten close enough to hit the door that hard. We checked the trail camera that faced the access trail and the cabin entrance. It had shut off sometime during the night. The batteries were fine. It just stopped recording. No footage, no evidence. We packed up and left the cabin quickly, skipping breakfast, too shaken to stay any longer. I haven't been back there alone since. Whenever I go out now, it's with a group. We all still wonder what could have caused those hits on the door and the strange silence that followed. It wasn't wildlife, and it wasn't some prank or accident. My friend's dad replaced the door after we left, but kept the dented metal panel in storage. He said he'd seen some strange things out in those woods over the years, but wasn't willing to go into detail. I don't think I want to know exactly what he saw. Whatever it was that night, it was strong, deliberate, and close enough to almost get inside. And it didn't want to be seen in the light. Since then, every time I think about that cabin and that night, I remember the silence most of all. The way the woods held their breath, and the way the door shook under those heavy hits. The dog's frozen stare, the absence of anything in the dirt outside, the thing that avoided the flashlight. It all felt too purposeful to be random, too deliberate to be accidental. That cabin still feels like it's surrounded by something just beyond the edge of the trees, watching, waiting. Something real and dangerous, but silent until it wants to make itself known. I'm not sure I ever want to find out exactly what that was, but I know I'll never forget that night. Back in 2018, I went on a trip that still haunts me in a way I can't quite explain. I've only told a few close friends about it, and one of them suggested I share it somewhere wider, just to see if anyone else has ever gone through something similar. But even now, years later, I'm not sure I want to fully understand what happened. I don't even know what to call it. It's not something simple like an animal encounter or a prank, and it's definitely not something I've been able to forget. I was 21 at the time, and I went up to rural northern Michigan. The plan was to visit an old family friend. Let's call him Tom. My dad and Tom had been close since they were kids, and Tom owned a small hunting cabin out near Burt Lake. It was deep in the woods, surrounded by thick forest and marshland. There were no neighbors for miles around. The kind of place where cell phone signals disappear, and the only road is a narrow dirt track that looks like it hasn't been touched since the 70s. My dad couldn't make the trip, so I went with my older brother to help Tom prepare the cabin for deer season. We had a list of chores: chopping firewood, cleaning up the cabin, getting the place ready for the hunters who would show up later in the fall. The cabin itself was small, only 2 rooms, no electricity, and heated by a wood stove that Tom fired up every evening. It was simple, old, and quiet in a way that felt like stepping back decades. Since space was tight inside, and it was still early fall, Tom told me I could sleep in his old pop-up camper. It sat about 200 feet behind the cabin, down a narrow dirt path and tucked under a cluster of ancient pine trees. The camper wasn't fancy, but it was dry, safe, and honestly, I liked the idea of some solitude out there. The sounds of the forest at night were something I didn't mind at all. The first night, we had chili around the fire. Tom told stories about bears he'd seen and strange things he'd noticed over the years in the forest. Nothing crazy, just odd enough to make you watch the trees a little more closely after dark. The crackling of the fire and the smell of smoke mixed with the sharp pine air made it feel like we were the only people on Earth. I headed to the camper around 11, carrying a headlamp and my sleeping bag. The path was narrow, just enough space for one person, with old pine needles covering the ground like a soft, crunchy carpet. About halfway down the path, I turned off my headlamp to look at the stars. The sky was crystal clear, and the stars stretched on forever. I remember thinking how peaceful everything was. But then I noticed something strange. It wasn't just quiet, it was dead silent. I mean, really silent. Not a single rustle, no breeze through the branches, no insects buzzing or chirping. The kind of silence that presses down on you and feels heavier than the night itself. It wasn't peaceful anymore, felt unnatural. And then the feeling came over me like a wave. I was being watched. Not the usual forest feeling where you sense a deer or a raccoon nearby, but something else. Something unseen just beyond the tree line. I can't explain it exactly, but it was like every nerve in my body was screaming that I was exposed, vulnerable, like prey caught in the open. My skin prickled. My heart started pounding. I didn't stop to think or question it. I just ran the rest of the way to the camper. Once inside, I slammed the door shut and locked both latches. My hands were shaking, and I told myself I was just rattled from the stories and the isolation, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I lay in my sleeping bag and tried to calm down, but the camper was too thin-walled to block the outside world. All night, I heard soft sounds outside, faint footsteps brushing leaves, scraping against the canvas sides. It never got close enough to be sure what it was, but it was definitely moving around, circling the camper. Every time I heard a sound, my heart jumped. I kept telling myself it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray deer, but the way it moved felt deliberate, like it was watching me, trying to figure out if I was a threat or easy prey. The next morning, I told my brother what happened. He laughed it off, teased me for being paranoid and too wound up from the woods and the stories. But Tom was quiet. He didn't say much, but I could tell he believed me. I think he'd seen or felt something similar before. That night, I asked if I could bring Tom's dog Scout with me to the camper. Scout was an older lab mix, usually lazy and calm but reliable. Having him with me felt like a good idea, a little extra security against whatever might be lurking out there. The walk back to the camper was better with Scout beside me. He was calm, trotting along like usual, sniffing the ground and wagging his tail. But as we neared the tree line, something changed. Scout stopped suddenly. His ears perked up sharply, and he lifted his head to the side. His tail dropped between his legs, and his body stiffened. He didn't bark or growl, he just refused to move forward. That's when I really started feeling that heavy, watchful presence again. We made it inside the camper, and Scout curled up next to me, looking uneasy. I thought maybe I'd finally relax, but I didn't get much sleep. I had a terrible, vivid dream that night. I heard my name whispered just outside the canvas wall. It wasn't a shout or a scream, just a quiet voice saying my name over and over. It didn't sound angry or mean, but it was wrong. Like it wasn't a person, more like a bad recording of my own voice repeating itself with a delay. I woke up sweating, and Scout was sitting upright, facing the corner of the camper. His hackles were raised, ears pinned back, eyes fixed on the canvas like something was right there, just out of sight. Morning came and I was relieved. I packed up and told Tom I was heading back a day early. He didn't question it, just nodded. Before we left, I took Scout out into the clearing behind the cabin, hoping some fresh air would clear my head. I walked a bit toward the edge of the woods, Scout sniffing around happily like nothing was wrong. Then I stopped. I saw strange marks in the dirt, deep jagged scratches leading from the edge of the woods into the clearing. The dirt looked torn up, like something with claws had dragged itself along the ground. I knelt to get a better look. The scratches were big, too big to be a dog or a deer. They went toward the woods but stopped suddenly, just ended, like whatever made them vanished into thin air. I stood up, feeling a cold knot in my stomach. I called Scout, but before I could finish, he froze. He was standing just beyond the scratches, staring into the trees, completely still. His eyes were wide, locked on something I couldn't see. His ears flattened, his tail hung low. He didn't even twitch. I started toward him, but a prickling sensation ran down my neck. That same feeling of being watched, but stronger, heavier, like there was something much bigger than me right there. When I reached Scout, I grabbed his collar and looked into his eyes. They were wide and terrified, staring straight into the woods. And then I heard it. My voice. It echoed from the trees. Quiet, slow, delayed, like a bad copy of my words. It wasn't loud or close, but it was unmistakably my voice repeating what I just said. Then I yelled, "Scout, come here." The voice echoed again, louder this time. It wasn't my voice anymore. It was wrong, sharp, and insistent. I froze. I didn't look back. I grabbed Scout and ran toward the cabin as fast as I could. Back inside, I tried to explain what I heard, but Tom just looked at me with a serious, unreadable expression. He told me that if I ever hear a voice coming from the woods, I had to ignore it completely and never respond. He said, "No matter what you think you hear, don't go toward it." Then he told me to stop thinking about it. I haven't been back since. My brother thinks it was just an echo or maybe my imagination messing with me in the dark. But I know what I heard. Tom knows more than he lets on, but he's never said another word. That weekend left me with a weight I still carry. The forest felt alive in a way I can't explain, like it was hiding something, watching, waiting. And that voice, my voice, echoing from nowhere, that's something I'll never forget. No ghosts, no fairy tales, just something real and heavy in the woods that night, something I don't want to meet again. I parked my truck at the edge of the dirt road, where it met the thin path that led deep into the woods. The sun was already low, pushing long shadows between the tall pine trees. I'd been looking forward to this weekend for weeks. A chance to get away from the city noise, away from work and the endless buzz of social media. The cabin was my refuge, a small, rough-hewn place built decades ago by the previous owner of this property. No electricity, no cell signal, just the quiet of the forest and the weight of solitude. Exactly what I wanted. I grabbed my backpack and the small cooler from the truck bed, making sure I had all my supplies. Canned food, a small camping stove, a headlamp with extra batteries, a stack of firewood I'd brought from home, and a few books to read. The air smelled like pine needles and damp earth. It was cool but not cold yet, the kind of evening where you can still smell the summer hanging on before the fall chill takes over. The trail wasn't much more than a narrow dirt path, winding between trees and over small roots. It was quiet except for the occasional rustle of a squirrel or bird. I moved slowly, not wanting to trip or make too much noise. The deeper I went, the darker it got. The thick canopy blocked the fading light, and my boots crunched on dry leaves. After about a mile, the cabin came into view. It sat in a small clearing, surrounded by tall spruce and fir trees. It looked weathered but solid, the wood dark and rough from years of rain and sun. The roof sagged a bit in the middle, and the porch had a few loose boards, but nothing dangerous. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was musty, smelling like old wood and dust, mixed with the faint scent of smoke from a previous fire. Inside, the cabin was small but cozy. A simple wooden table with 2 chairs sat near the window, and in the corner, a stone fireplace with a rusty metal grate. The floor was made of wide, worn planks, and a couple of shelves held a few old books and some dusty tins. There was a small bed in the back, covered with a rough wool blanket. No power, no running water, just a well outside near the back. I set my things down and lit a small fire in the hearth. The flame crackled and warmed the room, sending shadows flickering against the walls. I cooked a simple meal on my camping stove and ate slowly, listening to the quiet of the forest settling outside. The wind was low, but I could hear it gently moving the branches, a soft, almost whispering sound. After eating, I grabbed a book and sat in one of the chairs by the fire. The cabin felt peaceful, the kind of place where time slowed down. But as the night grew darker, I started to notice the smaller sounds, the creaks of the old wood settling, the distant calls of owls, the occasional snap of a twig outside. I told myself these were normal things, part of the forest's life, but they made me a little uneasy. It was the kind of quiet that made you listen too hard, waiting for something to break it. I decided to get ready for bed early. I stacked the firewood near the hearth and put out the fire, then crawled under the blanket on the narrow bed. I didn't need a flashlight in the cabin since the moon was bright, spilling pale light through the window. The woods outside looked like a silver-black wall, thick and unmoving. I lay there, eyes open, listening. The silence pressed against me, heavy and real. Then, I heard it. A faint, slow sound, like something dragging against the ground outside the cabin. My heart started to beat faster. The sound was soft, deliberate, slow. I told myself it was probably a branch or a rock moved by the wind, but it didn't feel right. It came again, a scraping noise, something heavy being pulled across the dirt. I got up quietly and walked to the window, peeking out into the dark. The trees stood motionless, the moonlight showing long shadows but nothing moving. The sound stopped. I waited, breath shallow, ears straining. Minutes passed, and then the scraping started again, this time closer, just beyond the edge of the clearing. My eyes tried to adjust, but I couldn't see anything. I stepped back from the window and grabbed my flashlight. I didn't want to go outside, but I felt like I had to check the perimeter. I opened the cabin door slowly, stepping onto the creaking porch. The night air was cold, sharper than inside. The forest looked black and solid, the trees like silent guards. I shined my flashlight into the clearing and then into the trees, scanning slowly. Near the edge of the clearing, the beam caught something. A large, dark shape half hidden under a pile of branches. At first, I thought it was a fallen tree or just a heap of wood, but the shape moved slightly. It shifted, just a little, like something breathing or alive. I froze, trying not to make a sound. The shape didn't move again, and the silence came rushing back. My mind raced. What was it? An animal? A deer? No, this was too big and too still. And the dragging sound, could it have been that? I closed the door quietly and locked it, my hands trembling. I went back inside and grabbed my phone, but as I'd expected, no signal. I turned on the flashlight app anyway, shining it around the cabin's interior to calm myself. I sat back down, heart still pounding. I thought about calling for help, but with no signal and miles of forest between me and the nearest road, that wasn't an option. I decided to stay awake a little longer, sitting close to the door, ready to lock it if needed. The dragging sound didn't come back, but I heard other noises, small snaps of twigs, leaves rustling, the soft footfalls of something moving just beyond the treeline. The forest was alive and watching. As the night deepened, I realized I wasn't going to get much sleep. I grabbed my small camping knife from my bag, something I rarely carried, but tonight it felt necessary. I kept it close just in case. Hours passed, the sky slowly lightening at the edges. When the first pink glow appeared on the horizon, the forest began to brighten. The dark shapes softened into clear trees, and the sounds of night animals faded, replaced by birdsong. I waited until the sun was up enough to shine directly into the clearing before stepping outside again. The cool morning air felt different, less threatening. I walked to the spot where I'd seen the shape. There was nothing there now, just a few scattered branches and a patch of disturbed dirt. No sign of whatever had been there, no footprints or marks. It was as if it had disappeared with the night. I decided to pack up and leave. There was no point in staying after that night. The forest was beautiful and peaceful by day, but the night had shown me a different side. A silent, watchful presence that I didn't want to test again. I loaded my things back into the truck, feeling the weight of the night's fear lift with the daylight. As I drove away, the cabin disappeared behind the trees, quiet and still. I didn't look back. The forest kept its secrets, but I knew I'd never forget that night. The scraping, the dark shape, and the feeling that something had been just out of sight, watching me from the shadows.